So let's review some of those guiding principles. So the first one I would say that comes to mind is URLs. Are no more URLs to services, but they're URL to resources. So it's really a resource orientation of the API. And so what is meant by that? So I can use the example of the basic outcome we've seen before. So in the basic outcome, in every launch, you were getting the outcome service URL. And this URL was taking XML commands. And in the XML, you needed to put the actual IDs that you wanted to modify. And actually, this was because this was passed to you as a second parameter as a result ID. So you see here the URL is really the URL of a service that takes XML commands, and the actual data you want to modify is another parameter. It's the ID. Well, a resource orientation URLs means that you actually blend those two together. And now what you get instead is a result URL. So you get an addressable location for this result. And now you can go on this result URL and directly interact with it using HTTP verbs rather than using XML commands. So you can say, give me the current grade. So it's going to be a get on this URL. No need to change any parameter or do anything. This URL is totally opaque. And you can actually put a new value in this URL if you want to change a grade, or you can maybe even clear a grade by calling delete on this endpoint. So traditionally, you do a get to get the current value, a post to create a new resource, a put to modify one, and a delete. That's kind of the traditional way to address that. And so I don't know if you remember, but in the tool consumer profile, we see get, post, put, and delete. So in the tool consumer profile, not only you're going to indicate that you expose locators to a given set of resource, but you're also going to say what kind of actions you would allow tool providers to do on those resources. And in the tool proxy, the tool provider would require all those verbs, or maybe just a subset. So maybe as a tool provider, you're only interested in doing a get. So in which case you say that for this resource, I'm only requesting to do get. That would be my tool proxy contract. So the third principle actually is going to be substitution parameters. And what I mean here is that the URLs you're going to use, it's not required that you have prior knowledge of those, or that you go look at the tool consumer profile and look what would be a template for that and try to find your way to put stuff into a URL template. No, URLs are passed on every launch, fully resolved. So they're completely opaque. And that's a great mechanics of LTI, because LTI is not just a set of services, but everything is triggered through that launch. So now, let's say there is a new service around, and you care to use that service. So when you're going to declare a link, you're going to say this link wants to have access to the service. So you're going to say, I'm going to have a new parameter, which is service URL. And you're going to say, okay, and what is going to be this value? This value is going to be, I don't know, like the service .url. And what happens at runtime, as you see here, it has a $sign. At runtime, the tool consumer is going to replace the service URL with the actual URL, which is going to be resolved based on the current context, on the current user, and it's going to be directly actionable by the tool provider. No prior knowledge of the URL, and URL template are not required. So URLs can be totally opaque. So now, those URLs are resources, so it becomes very important to understand what those resources are, and it's no more enough to know that they are JSON something. So media types become very important. So that's going to be the fourth principle here I would put here. You need to know the media type, and more importantly, you need to take part into content negotiation. To leverage the idea of content negotiation, which is part of the HTTP protocol. So to illustrate that, let's give an example. So let's say you have a service that represents, gives you access to some kind of resource, and it can either give you a flat representation of the resource, like a list, or it can give you a tree, a nested representation of the same resource. So it's two different representations. Depending on the use case, you might prefer the flat list, or in another case, you might prefer a tree representation. All of those would be done in JSON. So now you can define two media types. You're gonna find my flat media type, and it's gonna still be a JSON. That's gonna be your first media type, and you're gonna have the same one. It's like gonna be my tree representation plus JSON. So those are the two media types that the same resource can serve now. So it becomes important when you go around, you say which representation do you want to get. And actually, what we would rather not do is put a parameter, a query parameter, says I want version flat or version tree. Actually, there is a better mechanics than that, is to say what you accept. And in the HTTP header going out, you will say I accept the flat representation. So that's the accept header into HTTP request. So with these mechanics, a given resource can serve a variation of media types, a variation of representation of the same resource. And when you make a query to that endpoint, you can say which representation you would like to get. And you can actually even have different list here of media types, so that if the endpoint cannot honor the first one, then it's going to default on the second one. So now we have an endpoint that's expressing some JSON, and it's actually having a media type to qualify the JSON. But still the media type helps, that's for sure, but the JSON is still JSON, and if you want to understand it, you need to understand the media type. It means probably you need to go to some documentation that describes the media type and what's expected inside that JSON. So it would be nice if the JSON was in itself more self-descriptive, and this is why actually the JSON used in LTI services are actually not just plain JSON, but they are JSON enriched with a linked data semantic layer, and for that we use JSON-LD. And the nice thing about JSON-LD actually is that it's still plain JSON, so really most of the time when you have a JSON payload, making it JSON-LD is just adding an add context around it to say, okay, these things that you have in this JSON actually are mapping to those ontologies. Ontologies, you know, is a big name for just saying a set of common and shared definition. So best maybe is to go look at an example of that in the actual JSON-LD website. So if we go here, and we see we have a simple example of a JSON-LD. So let's just take it, copy it, and let's go to the playground, paste it in there. So we see we have name, born, spouse. Okay, so what does name means, what does born means, you know, and all of that is actually defined into now an ontology about persons that is actually shared. So the idea here is that not only you have ontologies, but you expect different kind of documents to try to use the same ontologies. And you'll see on the AMS website that it defines ontologies, and those ontologies are supposed to be reused across services. So then if a service exposes outcomes, and if two services expose these outcomes, they use the same JSON-LD to describe those outcomes. So going back here to the example, so this is a very compact format, something very typical. Again, if you just care about the JSON portion of it, this is kind of just, you can just easily ignore it. But now you can expand it. When you expand it, it's going to use a context to say, oh, actually name that we see here, the name is actually, that's actually this is a definition of name. And you see this is a full expanded definition, and we can go and have a look at it and say what is the name, and we go and have a look, and we can find the vocabulary here and find the name somewhere. One last thing about JSON-LD is the importance of linked data. So what is meant by that is that whenever you refer to an entity or resource, you try to avoid just plain or opaque IDs, but you try to give an ID that's actually a locator where you can go and get information, access that resource. So you see here, for example, spouse is not just you know, just a name. It's actually something here in this example you could use to actually dereference. So there are great videos on JSON-LD on YouTube, and I encourage you to have a look at those.